Hi everybody, it's Neil Augenstein here, and welcome to this week's Facebook Live on The Investigation Continues, our new podcast about the disappearance of the Lyon sisters. And appreciate you joining us here. I had to do a last-minute technical change, so I'm hoping that you're able to hear me okay. I guess if you're not able to hear me, please send me a message in the comments there, and I'll do what needs to be done so that you can hear me. But I trust that you are able to hear me. So right now, on Monday we released episode 3 of The Investigation Continues, and as you know, if you've listened to episode 3, there were a couple of developments that I wanted to chat about today. About a week after the Lyon sisters disappeared on March 25th, 1975, there was a man who was an IBM employee who was on his way to work in Manassas, Virginia. And he stopped at a stoplight, and he looked to the side, and there was a station wagon there. And he says that he saw in the back seat of the station wagon a young girl wearing glasses, blonde, blue eyes, and he recognized her, he said, as Sheila Lyon, who was the 12-year-old girl who was the older of the Lyon sisters. So he called police a little bit later, but actually before that, he tried to follow the car. He followed it for a bit. But at some point, he said the driver sped up and sped away. He told police that the person who was driving the car resembled the sketch of the person who Montgomery County Police had issued a sketch about this person who was wanted in connection with the Lyon sisters' disappearance. The man who we referred to last week as Tape Recorder Man. So Tape Recorder Man was the person who police thought might have been driving this station wagon, a 1968 beige Ford station wagon, according to the eyewitness who saw it that day. The eyewitness only was able to get the first 4 numbers and letters of the license plate because the license plate was bent. But he reported that to police. And police did, that number and description did get out. And later that night, an interesting thing happened. Truckers who had heard the lookout for the partial license plate took it upon themselves in spreading the information through the CB radio, and they started forcing beige station wagons off the side of the road and were doing their own investigation. They wanted to see whether one of the Lyon sisters was in the car. Also that night, there were people, some of them armed, who were chasing cars that seemed to match that description. There was an episode at Burke Lake in Burke, Virginia, and they thought that the station wagon there might have a good lead, but it turns out that it was an empty lead. And the Lyon sisters were not found that night, or the next day, or the day after that. But and police weren't sure whether this lead was a good one. They weren't sure whether they believed whether that this man had actually seen one of the Lyon sisters in the station wagon. It was more than a week after they disappeared from Wheaton Plaza. So that lead sort of stayed there for years, and it wasn't quite clear whether it was a good lead or not. Let's fast forward a bit. The years passed. John Lyon eventually did go back to work. Remember, he's the father of Sheila and Catherine Lyon. He was a host at WMAL, and he went back to work there. And so he was able to somehow get back to work and try to go on with life that way. Let's fast forward even more. In 1975, there was actually that's going back to the starting date, but just to give you a little background, in 1975 there was a man by the name of Fred Coffey, and he was in the Navy. But in early 1975, he moved to Montgomery County, Maryland, which, as you know, is where the Lyon sisters lived. And they disappeared on March 25th. On July 24th, 1975, a 15-year-old girl by the name of Kathy Beatty was brutally sexually attacked behind a Kmart in Aspen Hill, which was right across the street from where Fred Coffey worked. Now, the girl, Kathy Beatty, survived that beating, but she was in critical condition. She actually ended up dying a few days later. But when the news reports came out of the attack, they said that the young girl had been attacked. At that exact same time, Fred Coffey left his job and moved out of the area. He didn't. The excuse that he gave turned out to be a false one for why he left the area. But he moved down to North Carolina, down by the western tip of Virginia. And down there, we hear in the podcast that is where a number of young boys and girls ended up being sexually assaulted and killed. Reporter Gary Reels, who, if you remember, was a great reporter here in D.C. For decades, he tells the story in the podcast that in the 1980s, when detectives were trying to close open cases, including the Lyon sisters case, they tried to retrack the steps of Fred Coffey, who by then was serving a life sentence for the murder of a 10-year-old North Carolina girl. And they traced and they saw where Fred Coffey lived, the fact that he lived in Montgomery County at the time that the Lyon sisters were disappeared, and also that he'd left town with not a very good excuse. And so police were very interested in talking with Fred Coffey. He became the first person of interest. His name was reported, and Montgomery County police really wanted to talk with Fred Coffey. He ended up being sentenced to death, but his life sentence was vacated. And in the podcast, I did make a mistake. I want to tell you about it here. In the podcast, I said that while Fred Coffey never talked with police again about his perhaps involvement in any other cases, including the Lyon sisters case, I said that he took what he knew, if anything, to his grave. But I just found out today, looking through court records, which are available online, that Fred Coffey is still alive. He is still serving a life sentence in North Carolina, and he is expected to spend the rest of his life there. And there's no indication that he plans to give any interviews to anybody about that. But Fred Coffey is still alive, and I apologize for saying that he had died in the podcast, and I will change that. So if you listen to it in the near future, that part will be removed. So Fred Coffey was a person of interest. He turned out to not be Yes, Colin, that's my dog is choosing now to bark, so apologize for that. In my spacious home studio, my dog is upstairs, and I'm not sure whether he wants to be on the podcast or what, but that's him. So let's. That's sort of where things are on the podcast. I'd like to open things up for questions if you have any. Let me see. Okay, Quellen has a good question. If he was a person of interest and still alive, why are the cops not actually questioning him about the disappearance of the sisters? Well, he has a lawyer. He doesn't have to answer any questions from anybody. He's already serving his life sentence, and police have other information that that Lloyd Lee Welch, the person who is charged with their murders, is the person who killed them, and so that's obviously the case that police and prosecutors are making. They had a long time to look at coffee. I'm not sure. Obviously there's some similarities and there's some coincidences with Coffey's life and the way he was in Montgomery County at the same time that the Lyon sisters disappeared. But police have moved on from that, and there's no indication from looking at the court records that I've seen that Coffey is considered seriously in this case. As far as the license plate and the car, the station wagon that we were referring to before, that I believe is still in play, and I think we may hear about that in the trial of Lloyd Lee Welch. And the reason why I say that is that when I looked at the evidence that prosecutors declared that they may introduce at the trial of Welch, they include interviews with that witness, and the witness was a former, like I say, he's a former IBM employee. I've been in touch with him. He acknowledges that he may be called to testify in the trial, so he wasn't interested in doing an interview at this time. But and police were asked when Lloyd Lee Welch was named a person of interest and was eventually indicted. Police acknowledged that the station wagon clue is still very much a possibility. In fact, when Welch was indicted, police put out another request for anyone who lived down in Bedford County, Virginia, where police and prosecutors believe that the Lyon sisters' bodies were eventually brought. Police did ask anyone who lived in Bedford County to keep an eye out for that a station wagon. They weren't as specific as earlier, but the thought was that if there was an old station wagon that may be parked in someone's barn or on somebody's property, police wanted to know about it. So the station wagon could very well still be something that we'll hear about in trial. Let me just look through some of the questions here and see if there's anything that we want to discuss here. Thank you everyone for joining, and excuse me for 1 second. Okay. All right. So just to Dolly asks, how do we know if Lloyd is telling the truth? Well, why would somebody say that he was aware of a murder if he were already charged with that murder? Just by way of background for everyone who may not be aware, Lloyd Welch has changed his story several times over the years. When Montgomery County detectives first started talking with him in 2013, he was already serving time in Delaware for sexually assaulting another young girl. He was due to serve 29 years for that, and during that time, Montgomery County Police realized that he was the person who they believed had killed the Lyon sisters. When police first knew about Lloyd Welch back in the middle 70s, they did not think that Welch was involved, but then they were. This obviously was a case that perplexed detectives for almost 4 decades. Over the years, when they went back with a fresh set of eyes and a new detective, they realized that this guy who had lived nearby and was now serving a lot of time for sexually assaulting young girls was also in the area when the Lyon sisters disappeared, and they were able to determine that he was in fact at the Wheaton Plaza Mall the day that they disappeared, and that he in fact tried to talk with them on that day. Since then, Lloyd Welch has changed the story several times. At first he said he had nothing to do with it, then he said he left the mall with the girls, then he said he somehow knew that the girls had been abducted and sexually assaulted and burned in Bedford County, Virginia. But then he said that he had actually witnessed the girls, or one of the girls, being killed. So police are taking what he has to say, not at his word, but it seems that some of the things that he says are worth police following up on. They say that they have more evidence than just Lloyd Welch's word. He is set to go on trial in September, and he could face the death penalty because in Virginia, where he's charged with 2 counts of first-degree felony murder, he could be eligible for the death penalty. Prosecutors have not said for sure that that's where that's what they would seek, but it is still a possibility, and we'll find out what happens when trial begins, if in fact there is a trial. If anyone has any questions, be glad to look on the screen now and answer them. If the questions come to you after our session here, you can just leave them in the comments section, and I'll respond there, and we can keep up the conversation that way. The Dolly and Patty are having a little back and forth. Patty and Dolly both have, if you read the court documents, they both have been mentioned in them, and I thank them for joining us in this discussion now. Patty's the daughter of Richard Welch, who police at one point said that he was a person of interest in the case, but there's no indication that the police certainly have never charged Richard Welch, in this case, and there's no indication that they will charge him. He is still officially a person of interest, but I've seen no indication that police have any more evidence than they did when they first mentioned that. If there are any more questions, I'd be glad to take them. If not, we'll adjourn for today, and I'll look forward to following up on your questions on the Facebook page. Again, let me give you a little sneak peek of what's going on next week. Episode 4, which is next week, will be when we'll hear more about Lloyd Lee Welch, who is the person who is charged with a murder or the murders of the Lyon sisters. And we'll hear a little bit about how police put two and two and two and two together and came up with Lloyd Welch. The case is going to be September 12th. That's when the trial begins in Bedford County, Virginia. And there's always the possibility of a plea bargain, but I have heard nothing that a plea is in the works. Obviously, if there's any sort of developments, we will include that in the podcast. And so thank you for subscribing, either on iTunes or on Podcast One. And that way, regardless of what happens, whenever something does happen, we'll update the podcast, and you'll get a notification of a new episode, and you can hear it. There. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us on this chat. We do it every Tuesday. Again, we release a new podcast on Monday, and then we talk about it the following day here on Facebook. And your input is much appreciated, and really thank you for listening to the story, for being interested in the case, and for all your kind comments. So thank you, everybody. Leave any comments here, and we'll respond to them, and we'll catch up with you next week. Take care now.